So first off, thank you for having me here. So I'm Ketian, and I did my PhD in political science at MIT. So I'm currently a postdoc here at A Park. I'm a scholar of international relations and comparative politics. In particular, I study coercion, rising powers, economic statecraft, and territorial disputes in international relations, and social movements and nationalism in comparative politics. And I try to sort of bridge the discipline of comparative politics and international relations, and have a broader theoretical interest in linking international security and international economy. So basically, my research agenda sort of falls under the analysis of how a globalized economy affects the behavior of rising powers, such as China. Mm-hmm. So in this broader research frame, my specific research, especially my current book project, asks when, why, and how China coerces other states when faced with issues of national security, including territorial disputes, Taiwan, and Tibet. And related, I have other projects sort of focusing on how other powers and target states of Chinese coercion perceive Chinese coercion and the effectiveness or lack thereof. A significant portion of my book project focuses on territorial disputes, in particular the South China Sea. So sort of a general finding that I have found, because I focus on the post-Cold War period, so starting from 1990 all the way to the present. So I guess the first finding is that, contrary to sort of a conventional belief that China has become more assertive only after 2010, I would actually argue that China has always been assertive when it comes to disputes in the South China Sea. It actually used coercion quite a bit in the 1990s, and half of them were actually militarized coercion. But beginning 2007, it began to become more assertive again, but none of those post-2007 cases of Chinese coercion were militarized. So in this sense, China has always been a assertive power, but it's also quite cautious. So that's why I call it a cautious bully. We're coercing some states, but not others, and using coercion fairly cautiously. And the second point that my research sort of, indicates is that China coerces one target state to deter others. So to quote from a very ancient Chinese proverb, it is actually killing the chicken to scare the monkey. So for example, China coerces the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea to send a deterrent signal against other South China Sea claimants, including Malaysia, Brunei, etc. And the third point is that although ideally a rising power like China would want to use coercion to establish a sort of a credibility of result of being strong, it does come with it costs. The primary cost is economic. So basically, the Chinese rationale is that if China does not depend on the target state for its markets or supply, it's more likely to use coercion. But if it actually depends on the target state or needs the target state for particular kinds of materials or markets, so in the case of Malaysia, the liquefied natural gas, LNG, and some of the energy imports, it actually is less likely to use coercion. So I guess the fourth point is that China uses military coercion less when it believes that there is a greater likelihood that outside great powers might backlash against China, in particular with regard to the South China Sea context, that would be the United States. So it uses military coercion more in the 1990s when the United States actually left the Subic Bay in the Philippines. So in terms of the more recent developments in the South China Sea, in the last 2 years, things are a lot calmer. And I think part of the results could possibly be because of Chinese coercion in the past 4 years, in 2015 and 2016 in particular, that could potentially send a deterrent signal to the claimants in the South China Sea. And part of it also has to do with the domestic politics of Southeast Asian countries, in particular the Philippines, the changing administration into President Duterte. So they're currently sort of trying to work on the code of conduct to actually draft and come to a final declaration or signing a code of conduct in the South China Sea, but that's still something that's a work in progress. The article on the South China Sea, which is fortunately forthcoming in International Security this summer. article is in line with what I've sort of just laid out, sort of the general trends of Chinese coercion, sort of the dynamic of killing the chicken to scare the monkey, which is interestingly similar or generalizable to other areas of Chinese coercion, in particular with regard to foreign leaders' reception of the Dalai Lama. So that's another chapter in my book project. In particular with regard to Chinese coercion, use of economic sanctions against European countries such as France, Germany, and Britain. So the dynamic is similar to Chinese coercion in the South China Sea in that China coerces France and Germany in particular to scare the other potential monkeys in Europe, to deter them from receiving the Dalai Lama in the future. So that's something that I found quite similar in relation to the South China Sea article. So another related article that I'm also working on focuses on Taiwan, which is another sort of area that's also important, that somewhat remains a back burner, because I think a lot of the attention focuses on the South China Sea, which makes sense, but at the same time, from my research, the Chinese government views Taiwan as the core interest, way above other territorial disputes in the South and East China Sea. So if anything's negative is going to happen, it's more likely that a conflict might take place over something in Taiwan. So the article that I'm working on actually goes back to the 1990s to examine one of the less studied case of US and French arms sales to Taiwan in 1992. So both countries sold fourth generation fighters to Taiwan, which from the Chinese perspective could potentially tilt the balance of power between Taiwan and China. But interestingly, China coerced only France in using pretty harsh economic sanctions, even when it was much weaker in the 1990s, but did not coerce the United States at all. And in fact, if anything, China made promises publicly that it will buy more US aircraft, buy more wheat, exports from the United States, etc. So making it a quite interesting contrast. So my finding as of now is that economic concerns, especially trade negotiations with the United States at the time of US arms sales to Taiwan, trumped security concerns. Despite that being a core interest issue to China, China believed at the time economic relations with the United States was way more important than arms sales. Which is kind of interesting because it does speak potentially to sort of the current situation with regard to the US-China trade negotiations. What's interesting is that the Chinese concerns or the development of the Chinese economy is different from what it was back in the 1990s. So China was quite concerned about the United States potentially retaliating against China economically in the 1990s, precisely because China was highly dependent upon the United States for technology exports and foreign direct investment. But the current Chinese economy is still needs the United States and other countries, Europe, Japan in particular, but it's much more diversified. And China is also, starting from around 2008, right after the financial crisis, China began to try to move into or transition into a consumer or consumption-oriented economy that's basically focusing on domestic consumption, precisely because it knows that there is a high risk to depend mostly on exports. So I think the situation is a little bit different from the 1990s in the sense that China is definitely more powerful and has more exit options. It still needs the United States, but at the same time, the relationship is more of a mutual vulnerability or dependence, in the sense that it also hurts the United States if the United States did go through with tariffs increase, among other things, even though it will hurt China more. I really enjoyed the experience here, I think both for my academic advancement and sort of career advancement as well. So last fall, when I first started the fellowship, that was right when the academic job market started, and I was able to gain a lot of experience and advice and having sort of practice drop talks from or with a lot of the fellows and the faculty members here at APARC. And a lot of that was very useful for my actual job market, like interviews. And aside from that, I'm also So one of the South China Sea article that I was talking about, I was actually revising for resubmission to international security around the time when I was here at APARC. And I also got a lot of feedbacks from the faculty members here and the fellow colleagues too. So that's part of the process. And I think the other layer to APARC that I really enjoy as part of this postdoc is that it does offer a wide range of seminars and talks from outside speakers, a lot of them actual policy practitioners too, especially with regard to the trade issue that we talked about and sort of the U.S.-China security competition. There has been quite a few talks in this semester, and I was able to participate in all of them and interact with actual speakers who actually has had policy experience in a lot of the areas that I'm interested in. So that has been a pretty good experience overall for me. Aside from working on the book project, I will also try to start some new projects, excitingly. So one of them is actually related to the current project on Chinese coercion. So my book project focuses more from the Chinese perspective, asking China's rationale in deciding to coerce to begin with. But I do not look as much with regard to how other powers perceive Chinese coercion, targets of Chinese coercion, or regional powers and the United States. So I plan to, in maybe the next couple of years, to try to actually do fieldwork in Southeast Asia and East Asia to look at how different components of the society perceive Chinese coercion and whether Chinese coercion is effective or not in the short and long term, especially looking at different interest groups like the business community, the foreign policy community, the military, and the ordinary people, or some of the sectors and groups of people that were affected by Chinese coercion, for example, Philippine banana planters. So that's the next major project that I'm interested in. And another project that I'm thinking of, and I do have working papers on that too, is a completely different project, but it's something that I'm also interested in, which is the Chinese Civil War back in the 1920s and 30s all the way to the 40s. So I have a working paper focusing on the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party's alliance choices during the Civil War, and how great powers like the Soviet Union and the United States affect those alliance choices. In terms of, career path, I'll be starting at George Mason University's Schar School of Public Policy and Government as an assistant professor of international security beginning this summer. So that's a completely new experience for me, transitioning from a student to an actual faculty member. So that's an exciting path I have for me.